Good morning everyone, welcome to Jackanory, the latest instalment in the exciting story of George and his marvellous medicine. I hope you've been waiting with anticipation for today's episode. You'll remember when we last got together, George had to try out the medicine on the hen to prove to Grandma that it wasn't her magical powers that was making her grow through the roof. It was in fact George's medicine, and the hen grew larger and larger and larger during the test. And you might remember my really bad hen impression as well. So we're going to pick up the story from there. So imagine in the farmyard we have Grandma's head sticking out the farmhouse and a huge hen in the farmyard area near the tractors and the hay and all of that, and George stood in the outdoor area with his medicine and spoon in hand. Let's pick up the story from there. At that moment, George's mother came back from shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and she got out as you would do. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Ah! Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up, she could see Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles. She dropped the bag of groceries next. How about that then, eh, Mary? Which was Mum's name. Grandma shouted down. I'll bet you've never seen a hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is. But, stammered George's mother, unable to speak. It's George's magic medicine, Grandma shouted. We both had it, the hen and myself. But how in the world did you get up on the roof? Cried Mother. I didn't, cackled the old woman. My feet are still standing on the floor in the living room. Now this was far too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped and gasped and stared. She looked as if she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Killy Cranky. Now, Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. He was a kind father to George, but he wasn't an easy person to live with, because even the smallest thing got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing. And when Mr. Cranky saw it, he started jumping about as though something was burning his feet. Oh, great heavens, great heavens, great heavens, great heavens! Look at that, he cried, waving his arms. What's this? Oh, what's happened? Where did it come from? It's a giant hen. Who did it? I did, Dad, George said. And look at me, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. Never mind the hen, what about me? Mr. Cranky looked up and he saw Grandma. Oh, shut up, Grandma, he said. It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof. But it was the hen that excited Mr. Cranky. He'd never seen a hen like that before. But then, after all, who had seen a giant hen? It's fantastic, Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing round and round. It's colossal, it's gigantic, it's tremendous, it is an absolute miracle. How did you do it, George? Well, George started telling his father all about the magic medicine, And while he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went, warning here, chicken impression coming. Everyone stared at the hen, and when the hen stood up again, there was a brown egg lying there on the ground, and the egg was the size of a football. That egg there, it'd make scrambled egg for 20 people, Mr. Cranky said. George, Mr. Cranky shouted, how much of this medicine thing have you got? Well, I've got lots, Dad. There's a big saucepan full in the kitchen and the bottle over there is nearly full. Oh, come with me, Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. Bring the medicine. Oh, for years and years I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, and bigger sheep for mutton. I've got a wonderful idea, George. George thought, oh no, what is he going to do? So they wandered off to the fields nearby. They went to the pigsty first. George gave the spoonful of medicine to the pig, and as expected, the pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place, and then it grew, and it grew, and it grew, and in the end, they had a huge pig in the pigsty. Oh, this is fabulous, said Mr. Cranky. Are you sure, Dad, said George, as he looked at the huge pink mass in the pigsty. Next they went to the herd of fine black bulls that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some medicine, and yes, you can imagine what happened. The smoke, the jumping, and in the end, a field full of giant bulls. Next they moved on to the sheep. The sheep were all grazing in the field, and yes, they gave them the medicine, and then the smoke happened and the jumping, and by the end of the medicine, they had huge sheep in the field. George went across to his grey pony, who was called Jack Frost. He gave the pony the medicine, and the usual happened, and by the end, he had a huge grey pony. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. And you guessed it, they've got a giant nanny goat now. Wow. Now, while this was happening, Grandma was still up on top of the roof with her head sticking out and her feet on the ground. She could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running round and getting excited about enormous animals everywhere. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone with her head popping out the rooftop. She decided to get some attention. Hey, you! She yelled. George! Give me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little medicine-feeding beast. Don't listen to the old goat, Mr. Cranky said back on the ground. She's stuck where she is, and it's a good thing too. But, Dad, we can't leave her up there. What if it rains? George! Oh, you horrible little boy, you disgusting worm. Fetch me a cup of tea at once, and I want some currant cake. We'll have to get her out, Dad, George said. She won't give us any peace if we don't. Mrs. Cranky came outside, and she agreed with George. And she's my own mother, she said. She's a pain in the neck is what she is, Mr. Cranky said. I don't care. I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life. So, in the end, Mr. Cranky had to telephone a crane company and ask them to send their largest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels and there were 2 men inside it. The crane men climbed up onto the roof and they put ropes under Grandma's arms. And then she was lifted right up all the way through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma some good. It had not made her any less grumpy or nasty or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto his back. The ancient old hag was now as tall as a house, galloping about the farm on a gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Out of the way! Clear the dead! Stand back, you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you all to death!" And other silly things like that whilst on horseback. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back inside the house, she was clearly going to have to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. George thought that was a fabulous idea. So, lots have happened today. We've got loads of large animals everywhere. We've got a grandma galloping around the farmhouse. We've got a dad excited about probably becoming the richest farmer ever. We've got an upset mum, and I think we've just got a curious George, really, haven't we? So much has happened. Tune in tomorrow to find out what happens next on the Cranky's farm.